There's a secret I've been hiding from my family for 3 years. A secret so big that when it comes out, it will turn their world upside down. And on this Thanksgiving Day, as my daughter in law Amanda humiliated me in front of everyone, calling me just the help in my own home, I decided it was time for the truth to come out. Time for Amanda to discover who really finances everything she takes for granted. My name is Elizabeth Thompson. I'm 68 years old, and today, in my Seattle home, at my own dinner table with my own family, I'm going to reveal the biggest secret of my life because enough is enough.
The Elizabeth Thompson everyone knows, a modest widow living on Social Security, dependent on her son's help, a quiet old woman sitting in the corner, grateful for whatever scraps of attention her family throws her way. Someone who clips coupons, shops at discount stores, and carefully counts every penny because that's all she has left. The real Elizabeth Thompson, founder and CEO of Thompson Property Holdings, owner of 52 properties across Seattle and the greater Washington area, a real estate empress with an $18.5 million portfolio who built her empire from nothing while everyone around her assumed she was just another struggling senior citizen barely making ends meet. I've been hiding this secret for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days to be exact. Why? Because I wanted to know if my family loved me for money or for who I am. Unfortunately, after 1,172 days of careful observation, meticulous note-taking, and heartbreaking realizations, I now know the answer with crystal clarity. It all started after my husband Robert's death on March 15, 2018. The funeral was on a rainy Tuesday morning, and as I stood by his graveside watching the casket being lowered into the soggy Seattle soil, I felt something more than grief. I felt liberation. Not because I didn't love Robert, I did in my own complicated way, but because for the first time in 42 years of marriage, I was free to be myself. When Robert died, everyone believed he left me $45,000 and this house. The lawyer, Harold Fieldstone, read the will in his dusty downtown office while my son David sat beside me, occasionally patting my hand in what I suppose he thought was a comforting gesture. The entire estate, minus some small bequests to distant relatives, came to me. Everyone in that room, David, his wife Amanda, even Mr. Fieldstone himself, assumed that was everything. A modest inheritance for a modest widow. But there was something Robert didn't know, something I had carefully hidden from him for over 2 decades. I had received a substantial inheritance before our marriage and had invested it with the kind of strategic brilliance that would have shocked anyone who knew me as the quiet, submissive wife who always deferred to her husband's judgment on everything from dinner choices to vacation destinations. Let me take you back to 1994, when I was a very different woman. I was 39 years old, recently graduated from the University of Washington with a master's degree in finance, and
The Elizabeth Thompson everyone knows, a modest widow living on Social Security, dependent on her son's help, a quiet old woman sitting in the corner, grateful for whatever scraps of attention her family throws her way. Someone who clips coupons, shops at discount stores, and carefully counts every penny because that's all she has left. The real Elizabeth Thompson, founder and CEO of Thompson Property Holdings, owner of 52 properties across Seattle and the greater Washington area, a real estate empress with an $18.5 million portfolio who built her empire from nothing while everyone around her assumed she was just another struggling senior citizen barely making ends meet. I've been hiding this secret for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, to be exact. Why? Because I wanted to know if my family loved me for money or for who I am. Unfortunately, after 1,172 days of careful observation, meticulous note-taking, and heartbreaking realizations, I now know the answer with crystal clarity. It all started after my husband Robert's death on March 15th, 2018. The funeral was on a rainy Tuesday morning, and as I stood by his graveside, watching the casket being lowered into the soggy Seattle soil, I felt something more than grief. I felt liberation, not because I didn't love Robert, I did, in my own complicated way, but because for the first time in 42 years of marriage, I was free to be myself. When Robert died, everyone believed he left me $45,000 and this house. The lawyer, Harold Fieldstone, read the will in his dusty downtown office while my son David sat beside me, occasionally patting my hand in what I suppose he thought was a comforting gesture. The entire estate, minus some small bequests to distant relatives, came to me. Everyone in that room, David, his wife Amanda, even Mr. Fieldstone himself, assumed that was everything. A modest inheritance for a modest widow. But there was something Robert didn't know, something I had carefully hidden from him for over 2 decades. I had received a substantial inheritance before our marriage and invested it with the kind of strategic brilliance that would have shocked anyone who knew me as the quiet, submissive wife who always deferred to her husband's judgment on everything, from dinner choices to vacation destinations. Let me take you back to 1994, when I was a very different woman. I was 39 years old, recently graduated from the University of Washington with a master's degree in finance, working as a junior analyst at Morrison & Associates, a small but prestigious investment firm in downtown Seattle. My grandfather, Edgar Whitman, had just passed away at the age of 92, leaving me $250,000, a fortune by 1990 standards, especially for a young woman just starting her career. Robert, whom I had been dating for 2 years, was charming and ambitious, but had very traditional ideas about marriage and money management. When he proposed 6 months after grandfather's death, he made it clear that he expected to handle all our financial affairs. "Don't worry your pretty head about money, Lizzie," he used to say, using the pet name I grew to despise. "That's a man's job. You just focus on making our home beautiful." But I wasn't ready to give up my financial independence. Instead, I did something that would define the next 3 decades of my life. I lied. I told Robert that grandfather had left me only $5,000, which I dutifully turned over to him for our wedding expenses. The remaining $245,000 I invested under my maiden name, Whitman, creating a separate financial identity that Robert never discovered. In 1994, Seattle was on the verge of a transformation that most people couldn't see coming. Microsoft was growing exponentially. Amazon was just a crazy idea in Jeff Bezos's head, and real estate prices were still reasonable for those smart enough to recognize what was about to happen. I bought my first property with that inheritance money, a small duplex in the Capitol Hill neighborhood for $89,000. The remaining funds went into carefully selected tech stocks and municipal bonds. Over the years, as Robert thought he was managing our modest household budget, balancing our checkbook, and making decisions about major purchases, I was quietly building an empire. When the dot-com boom hit in the late 1990s, my tech investment soared beyond anything I had imagined. When the housing market exploded in the 2000s, my real estate portfolio multiplied in value year after year. During the 2008 financial crisis, while everyone else was panicking and selling, I was buying distressed properties at basement prices, using profits from my other investments. By 2010, when Seattle officially became a major tech hub with companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook establishing major operations here, my property values had increased exponentially. The little duplex I bought for $89,000 was now worth $450,000.
The commercial building I purchased in Ballard during the 2008 financial crisis for $200,000 was valued at $1.2 million. Every year, I quietly added more properties to my portfolio, reinvesting rental income and capital gains into new acquisitions. Through it all, Robert remained blissfully unaware. He saw the bills I chose to show him, knew about the checking and savings accounts I allowed him to manage, and believed he was the sole provider for our family. I played the role perfectly. The grateful wife, the careful budgeter, the woman who clipped coupons and shopped for bargains because we need to watch our pennies. When Robert died in 2018, I secretly owned 52 properties, worth a combined $14.8 million. My stock portfolio was valued at $2.1 million. My monthly rental income was $195,000. I was financially independent beyond most people's wildest dreams, yet I lived in a modest house, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and let my family believe I was struggling to make ends meet on Social Security.
Why did I continue this charade after Robert's death? Because I had learned something during those years of secret wealth accumulation. Money changes how people treat you, and not always for the better. I had watched wealthy friends become surrounded by people who wanted something from them. I had seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes and children who became entitled and lazy, expecting handouts rather than working for their own success. After Robert's funeral, I made a decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I would test my family. I would discover whether they loved Elizabeth the person or Elizabeth the potential ATM. The test was simple. I would continue living modestly, accepting their help and occasional financial assistance, and observe how they treated me when they believed I had nothing to offer them but the burden of an aging mother. The results of that test broke my heart in ways I never imagined possible. The changes didn't happen overnight. In the weeks immediately following Robert's funeral, my son David was attentive and caring. He called every day, stopped by frequently with groceries or flowers, and even suggested I might want to move in with him and his wife Amanda temporarily. Until you get back on your feet, Mom. At first, I thought this was genuine concern. David had always been a good son, though somewhat distant since his marriage. He was 43 years old, a successful software engineer at Microsoft, married to Amanda for 3 years, and the father of 2 children from Amanda's previous marriage, Sophie, then 12, and Mason, then 9. Our relationship had been cordial, but not particularly close, especially after he married Amanda and seemed to adopt many of her opinions and attitudes. Amanda Foster Thompson was everything I wasn't, young at 35 to my 65, beautiful in a polished professional way that came from expensive salons and personal trainers, successful in her own right as a corporate lawyer at his downtown firm, and supremely confident in every situation. When David first introduced her to us 3 years earlier, I was impressed by her accomplishments and hopeful that she might bring some energy and joy into our rather staid family dynamic. The first few months after Robert's death, Amanda was surprisingly warm toward me. She would call to check on me, invite me to family dinners, and even suggested we go shopping together for some new clothes to cheer me up. I was touched by these gestures and began to think that perhaps Robert's death, tragic as it was, might actually bring our family closer together. But gradually, subtly, things began to change. The first shift I noticed was in the frequency of David's visits. In April 2018, the month after Robert's funeral, David came by at least twice a week, staying for hours to chat or help with small household tasks. By June, it was once a week. By September, I was lucky to see him every other week, and when he did come, the visits were shorter and more perfunctory, as if he was checking items off a to-do list rather than spending time with his mother. "Sorry, Mom, but Amanda has that charity gala tonight, and we need to find a babysitter for the kids," he would say, already backing toward the door after 20 minutes of stilted conversation about my health and whether I needed anything from the store. The phone calls became less frequent, too. Where we once talked for an hour about everything and nothing, his work, the children's activities, neighborhood gossip, memories of Robert, our conversations shrank to brief check-ins about my health and whether I needed anything from the store. Amanda's warmth also began to cool, though so gradually that I initially attributed it to her busy work schedule and the demands of raising 2 children while maintaining her career. The shopping invitations stopped. The dinner invitations became less frequent. When I did join them for meals, I began to notice that Amanda would direct most of her conversation toward David or the children, treating me with polite but distant courtesy, like a house guest who had overstayed her welcome. But the most significant change was in how they began to view my financial situation. In November 2018, 8 months after Robert's death, I experienced what I now realize was a carefully orchestrated intervention. David and Amanda invited me for Sunday dinner, and after the children had been sent to their rooms to do homework, they sat me down for what they called a family discussion about your future. "Mom," David began, using the serious tone he employed when discussing technical problems at work, "Amanda and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your financial situation." I felt the flutter of anxiety, wondering if somehow they had discovered my secret. Had they seen something, noticed something, found some document I carelessly left lying around? "What do you mean?" Amanda took over, her lawyer's training evident in the way she presented her case with facts and figures. "Elizabeth, we know Dad didn't leave you very much. The house is paid off, which is good, but the maintenance cost, property taxes, and utilities must be eating up most of your Social Security check. We're worried about how you're going to manage long term, especially if you have any major expenses or health issues." I should have corrected their assumptions right then. I should have told them that I was financially secure, that I didn't need their help or their pity, that I could probably buy and sell their house 10 times over without feeling the pinch. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about where this conversation was heading. Maybe it was the memory of my wealthy friend Margaret Chen, whose adult children had fought so viciously over her money that they destroyed their family relationships long before she died. Instead, I played along. "Well, I'm managing so far. I've learned to be quite frugal." David and Amanda exchanged glances, and I saw something in their eyes that I didn't like. Satisfaction. They were pleased to have their assumptions confirmed. "The thing is, Mom," David continued, "we want to help. We've been blessed financially, and it's only right that we support you in your retirement. You sacrificed so much for me when I was growing up, working those double shifts when Dad was struggling to get his business off the ground." Actually, I had never worked double shifts. Robert's business had never struggled. But this was the story they had apparently constructed about my past, and it fit with their current narrative about my supposed poverty. "That's very kind, but I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Amanda interrupted, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "Your family, but we think it would be smart to be proactive about this. Maybe we could set up a small monthly allowance to supplement your Social Security. Nothing huge, just enough to give you some breathing room." They were offering to give me money. My son and daughter-in-law, who earned a combined income of $167,000 per year, were offering to support me, a woman whose monthly rental income alone was $195,000. The irony was so profound that I almost laughed out loud. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I felt a cold curiosity about how this dynamic would develop. How would they treat me if they believed I was dependent on their generosity? How would their attitudes toward me change if they saw themselves as my financial rescuers rather than my equals?
That's very generous, but are you sure you can afford it? Again, that exchange of glances. We'll manage, David said. Maybe $300 a month to start with, just for groceries and incidentals. And so it began. $300 a month from my son and daughter-in-law, carefully transferred to my checking account on the first of each month. Money I didn't need, from people who earned less in a year than I made in rental income in 6 weeks. At first, I thought the arrangement might actually improve our relationship. They would feel good about helping me, and I would benefit from their increased attention and involvement in my life. But I was wrong about the direction that attention would take. Instead of treating me as a cherished family member they were privileged to help, they began treating me as a charity case they were managing. The subtle condescension began almost immediately. "Mom, you really should shop at Safeway instead of Whole Foods. I know the quality is a little lower, but at your age, you need to prioritize value over luxury." At your age. As if being 66 years old meant I no longer deserved quality food or had the right to make my own choices about what I put in my body.
Maybe we should look into getting you a senior discount card for the bus system, David suggested during another conversation. It would be much more economical than driving everywhere. Plus, at some point, you're going to need to think about whether it's safe for you to be driving. Whether it was safe for me to drive? I was 66, not 96. My reflexes were fine, my vision was fine, and I had never had so much as a fender bender. But in their minds, I was already sliding into decrepit old age, someone who needed their protection from my own poor judgment. The monthly check-ins about my finances became more intrusive. They wanted to see my utility bills, to review my grocery receipts, to understand where every penny was going. They framed it as caring concern, but it felt like surveillance. "We just want to make sure you're making the most of your limited resources," Amanda explained when I gently protested their scrutiny. "It's important to plan ahead for any unexpected expenses." Limited resources. If only they knew.
By the summer of 2019, a full year after Robert's death, the dynamic had solidified into something I found increasingly uncomfortable. David and Amanda had appointed themselves as my financial guardians, and I had somehow become a project they were managing rather than a person they were loving. Their monthly contribution had increased to $500, which they assured me was no burden for them, but which came with increasing strings attached. They wanted monthly reports on my spending. They had opinions about everything from my choice of doctor, Dr. Williams charges too much, you should switch to someone in the Medicare network, to my grocery shopping, Mom, organic vegetables are a waste of money at your income level. But more troubling than their financial micromanagement was the way their fundamental attitude toward me was changing. I was no longer David's mother who happened to need some financial assistance. I had become their elderly dependent, someone whose decisions required their approval and whose independence was becoming inconvenient. The shift became crystal clear during what I now think of as the incident of the broken dishwasher. In August 2019, my dishwasher, which was nearly 15 years old, finally died. It was a minor inconvenience. I could easily afford to buy a new one, and in fact, I had always preferred hand-washing dishes anyway. But when I mentioned the broken appliance during one of our weekly phone calls, David and Amanda went into crisis management mode. "Mom, you can't be without a dishwasher," David said, as if I had announced I was moving into a cave. "That's way too much work for someone your age." "Actually, I don't mind washing dishes by hand."
No, Amanda interrupted. "That's not a long-term solution." "But dishwashers are expensive. A decent one costs at least $600. They spent the next week researching dishwashers, comparing prices, and debating whether I could afford such a major purchase. Finally, they presented me with their solution. They would buy me a dishwasher, but it would have to be a basic model from a discount store, and I would need to pay them back over 6 months. "We found a perfectly adequate dishwasher at Home Depot for $350, Amanda announced proudly. "It's not fancy, but it will do the job. We can put it on our credit card, and you can pay us back $60 a month until it's paid off." I stared at them, speechless. They were offering to loan me $350 for a dishwasher, to be paid back in installments, while I was sitting on liquid assets worth millions of dollars. The absurdity was beyond anything I could have imagined. But what struck me most was not the financial absurdity, but the emotional dynamic. They weren't offering this as a gift to a beloved mother. They were structuring it as a loan to a credit risk, complete with payment terms and conditions. They had mentally categorized me as someone who needed to prove her financial responsibility before being trusted with a $350 purchase. Starting in September 2019, I began what I now think of as my dependency experiment. I wanted to see exactly how David and Amanda would treat me if they believed I was becoming increasingly dependent on their support. I also wanted to understand whether their behavior stemmed from genuine love and concern or from something else entirely. The experiment had several components. First, I began occasionally asking for small amounts of financial help beyond their monthly contribution. Nothing dramatic. $200 here, $150 there, always with plausible explanations. An unexpectedly high heating bill, a dental procedure that wasn't fully covered by Medicare, car repairs that seemed to come out of nowhere. Second, I started presenting myself as slightly more confused and helpless than I actually was. I would call David to ask for help with simple computer problems I could easily solve myself. I would mention feeling overwhelmed by paperwork or household maintenance tasks that I had been handling competently for decades. Third, I began accepting more of their offers to help with errands and decision-making, even when I didn't need help. When Amanda offered to come grocery shopping with me to make sure you're getting the best deals, I accepted. When David suggested he should be present for my doctor's appointments to help you ask the right questions, I agreed. The results of these experiments were both fascinating and heartbreaking. The financial requests were always met with a mixture of concern and barely concealed frustration. They would agree to help, but with increasingly elaborate lectures about budgeting and planning ahead. Each request seemed to confirm their belief that I was financially irresponsible and incapable of managing my own affairs. "Mom, you really need to start keeping better track of your expenses," David would say after I asked for help with the supposedly unexpected car repair bill. "These surprise costs shouldn't be surprises if you're planning properly." The requests for help with simple tasks initially seemed to please them. They appeared to enjoy being needed, being the competent ones who could solve my problems. But over time, I noticed that their willingness to help came with increasing impatience and condescension. When I called David for help with my computer, he would sigh audibly before saying, "Mom, we went through this last week. You need to write these things down." When I accepted Amanda's offer to help with grocery shopping, she would take over entirely, making decisions about what I should and shouldn't buy based on her assessment of what was appropriate for someone in my financial situation. "Elizabeth, you don't need organic milk," she would say, removing items from my cart. "The regular milk is just as good and costs half as much." But the most revealing aspect of the experiment was how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear them. I have excellent hearing, something that served me well during this period. When they would step into another room to have whispered conversations about the mom situation, I could usually hear every word. These conversations gave me insight into their private thoughts about me and our relationship. "She's getting more confused," Amanda said during one such conversation in my kitchen while I was supposedly napping in the living room. "Did you see how she couldn't remember how to log into her email account?" "I'm worried about her driving," David replied. "Maybe we should start thinking about when we're going to need to take her keys away." Take my keys away? I was 67 years old, with perfect vision, excellent reflexes, and a spotless driving record. But in their minds, I was already approaching the point where I would need to surrender my independence. "The bigger issue is going to be this house," Amanda continued. "It's way too big for her, and the maintenance costs are only going to get worse. At some point, we're going to need to have a serious conversation about her moving into senior living." Senior living? They were already planning to move me out of my own home, the home I owned, free and clear, the home that was worth $2.8 million in the current market. These conversations confirmed what I had begun to suspect. They weren't helping me out of love or respect. They were managing what they saw as the problem of my existence. In their minds, I had become a burden to be handled rather than a person to be cherished. By 2020, the pattern was well established. I had become, in David and Amanda's minds, an increasingly dependent elderly woman who required their guidance and support. They had appointed themselves as my unofficial guardians, and I had allowed them to assume this role in order to understand their true feelings about me. But 2020 brought new challenges that tested the limits of their patience and my own endurance of their condescension. The pandemic, oddly enough, initially brought us closer together. When the lockdowns began in March, David and Amanda were genuinely concerned about my health and safety. They insisted on doing my grocery shopping, helped me set up video calling so we could stay in touch, and checked on me daily. For a brief time, I thought perhaps their caring was genuine after all. They seemed worried about me as a person, not just as a problem to be managed. David would call every morning to make sure I was feeling well. Amanda would drop off homemade meals, leaving them on my porch with cheerful notes. But as the months wore on and the initial crisis atmosphere faded, their pandemic-era helpfulness evolved into something more controlling. They had gotten used to managing my life during the emergency, and they seemed reluctant to give up that authority even as restrictions began to lift. "Mom, I really don't think you should be going to the grocery store yet," David said in July 2020 when I suggested I was ready to resume normal shopping. "It's still too dangerous for someone your age." "I'll wear a mask and be careful." "No, it's better if we keep handling your shopping. We're younger and healthier. If one of us gets sick, it's not as big a deal." Not as big a deal, because my life was somehow less valuable than theirs. They had also gotten used to having detailed knowledge of my daily activities, and they expected that level of involvement to continue. "You need to keep letting us know where you're going," Amanda informed me as businesses began reopening. "What if something happens and we need to reach you?" The financial dynamic also intensified during this period. They had increased their monthly support to $800, ostensibly to help with increased costs during the pandemic, but the additional money came with additional oversight. "We need to see all your bank statements," Amanda announced during one of our monthly budget meetings, which had become a regular feature of our relationship. "We want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of by any scams or predatory businesses." Bank statements. They wanted to see my bank statements. If they had succeeded in this request, they would have discovered that my checking account typically maintained a balance
Of around $50,000, far more than any retiree living on Social Security should have. They would have seen regular deposits from my property management company, deposits that would have immediately revealed my true financial situation. I managed to deflect this request by claiming that I found their level of financial scrutiny overwhelming and embarrassing. I played the role of the proud elderly woman who was ashamed of her poverty and didn't want her financial struggles exposed to detailed examination. But the most significant development of 2020 was the first major financial emergency that revealed the true extent of their expectations and attitudes. In October 2020, I called David in what I presented as a state of panic. I told him that I had received a notice from the city saying that my sewer line needed to be replaced, a major repair that would cost $15,000. I said I was devastated because I didn't have that kind of money and didn't know what to do. Of course, this was completely fabricated. My sewer line was fine, and even if it hadn't been, $15,000 was pocket change compared to my actual resources. But I wanted to see how they would respond to what they believed was a genuine financial crisis in my life. Their response was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. First, they didn't offer to simply give me the money, despite the fact that $15,000 represented only about 3 months of their combined salary. Instead, they immediately began discussing loan options, payment plans, and whether the repair was really necessary. "Are you sure you can't just patch it for now?"
Amanda asked. $15,000 seems like a lot for a sewer repair. Maybe we could get a second opinion, David suggested, or look into whether the city has any assistance programs for seniors. They were treating a major infrastructure problem in my home, a problem that could potentially make the house uninhabitable, as a discretionary expense that might be postponed or avoided entirely. Second, they seemed less concerned about my immediate problem than about the precedent it might set. I could hear them whispering to each other about whether this was the beginning of a lot of expensive house problems and whether it might be time to seriously consider other living arrangements for me. Other living arrangements. One fake sewer repair bill, and they were already planning to use it as justification for moving me out of my home. Finally, when they did offer help, it came with conditions that revealed their true feelings about our relationship. They offered to loan me $10,000 toward the repair, with the remaining $5,000 to come from my emergency fund, which they assumed must exist somewhere. The loan would be repaid at $200 per month over 4 years with interest.
Interest. They were going to charge their supposedly struggling elderly mother interest on an emergency loan? We want to help, David explained, but we also want to make sure you learn to plan better for these kinds of unexpected expenses. Paying interest will help you remember to save up for future repairs. They were going to use my financial desperation, or what they believed was my financial desperation, as a teaching moment about fiscal responsibility. By November 2021, I had endured 3.5 years of being treated as an increasingly burdensome dependent by my own family. The monthly allowance had grown to $1,000, which they never failed to remind me was a significant sacrifice for them. Their oversight of my life had become suffocating, and their casual dismissal of my autonomy and intelligence had become routine. But I had also learned everything I needed to know about their true feelings toward me. The experiment was complete, and the results were conclusive. David and Amanda loved the idea of being generous and caring, but they didn't actually love me. They loved the version of themselves that their relationship with me allowed them to project, the dutiful son and daughter-in-law who sacrificed for their elderly family member. But they resented the actual work and cost of maintaining that image. I decided that Thanksgiving 2021 would be the end of the charade. The holiday seemed appropriate for revealing truths about family, gratitude, and what we really value in our relationships with each other. But I wanted the revelation to be triggered by their own behavior, not by my arbitrary decision to end the pretense. I wanted them to cross a line that would justify my response, so that when the truth came out, it would be clear that their treatment of me had made the deception necessary. I didn't have to wait long. The trouble began 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, when Amanda called to discuss the holiday arrangements. "Elizabeth, we need to talk about Thanksgiving," she said in the brisk, businesslike tone she used when she had decided something and was simply informing me of her decision. "Of course. I'm looking forward to hosting everyone again." "Well, that's what we need to discuss. David and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we hosted this year." I felt a flicker of surprise. I had been hosting Thanksgiving for David's family since Robert's death. It was one of the few traditions that had remained unchanged, one of the few areas where I still felt like the family matriarch rather than the family dependent. By November 2021, I had endured 3.5 years of being treated as an increasingly burdensome dependent by my own family. The monthly allowance had grown to $1,000, which they never failed to remind me was a significant sacrifice for them. Their oversight of my life had become suffocating, and their casual dismissal of my autonomy and intelligence had become routine. But I had also learned everything I needed to know about their true feelings toward me. The experiment was complete, and the results were conclusive. David and Amanda loved the idea of being generous and caring, but they didn't actually love me.
They loved the version of themselves that their relationship with me allowed them to project, the dutiful son and daughter-in-law who sacrificed for their elderly family member. But they resented the actual work and cost of maintaining that image. I decided that Thanksgiving 2021 would be the end of the charade. The holiday seemed appropriate for revealing truths about family, gratitude, and what we really value in our relationships with each other. But I wanted the revelation to be triggered by their own behavior, not by my arbitrary decision to end the pretense. I wanted them to cross a line that would justify my response, so that when the truth came out, it would be clear that their treatment of me had made the deception necessary. I didn't have to wait long. The trouble began 3 weeks before Thanksgiving when Amanda called to discuss the holiday arrangements. "Elizabeth, we need to talk about Thanksgiving," she said in the brisk, business-like tone she used when she had decided something and was simply informing me of her decision. "Of course, I'm looking forward to hosting everyone again." "Well, that's what we need to discuss. Dava and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we hosted this year." I felt a flicker of surprise. I had been hosting Thanksgiving for David's family since Robert's death. It was one of the few traditions that had remained unchanged, one of the few areas where I still felt like the family matriarch rather than the family dependent.
Oh, is there a particular reason?
Several reasons, actually. First, we're worried about the expense for you. Thanksgiving dinner for 6 people is costly, and we know money is tight. Money is tight. If only she knew. Second, we think the cooking might be too much work for someone your age. It's a lot of preparation, and we don't want you to exhaust yourself. Someone your age. I was 68, not 88. And finally, my mother is coming this year, and we thought it would be nice for her to see our home and meet the kids in a more comfortable setting. Her mother was coming. Barbara Foster, whom I had met exactly twice in the 4 years David and Amanda had been married. A woman who lived in Phoenix and rarely visited Seattle, partly because she found the Pacific Northwest dreary and depressing. I see. When did you decide this? We've been discussing it for a few weeks. We wanted to make sure we had all the logistics worked out before we talked to you about it. They had been planning this for weeks without consulting me. They had made a unilateral decision to take over the one family tradition I still controlled, and they were informing me of their decision after the fact. "What would you like me to bring?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, you don't need to bring anything special. Maybe a side dish or dessert? Something simple that won't be too much work for you." A side dish. They had reduced me from the hostess of our family's most important gathering to a guest who might be permitted to contribute a simple side dish if it wasn't too much work for me. I was thinking maybe you could make the green bean casserole. You know, the one from the can with the crispy onions on top? That's always been popular, and it's not too complicated. The green bean casserole from the can, not my famous herb-crusted Brussels sprouts with pancetta that David had loved since childhood. Not my grandmother's cornbread stuffing recipe that had been the centerpiece for our family Thanksgivings for decades. A simple processed side dish that required no real cooking skill and could be prepared by anyone with the ability to read a soup can label. Over the next 2 weeks, Amanda called me regularly to update me on her preparations and to make it clear how much money she was saving me.
"I found a turkey at Safeway for $28, she announced proudly. "It's not organic, but honestly, I think all that organic stuff is just marketing anyway." "I'm making stuffing from a box instead of from scratch," she said during another call. "It tastes basically the same, and it's so much more convenient." My mother suggested we have wine from Trader Joe's instead of expensive bottles. She found a perfectly good Chardonnay for $7. Each update was presented as evidence of her superior planning and practicality.
She was showing me how Thanksgiving should be done by someone who understood the value of money, unlike the foolish old woman who had been wasting hundreds of dollars on unnecessary luxury. But the most telling update came 3 days before Thanksgiving. I wanted to let you know that my mother will be staying with us for the whole weekend. She's flying in Wednesday night and leaving Sunday morning. Since she doesn't get to see the kids very often, we're planning to keep the holiday weekend pretty family-focused. Family-focused? Barbara Foster was family, but I was just, what? An obligation to be managed? I thought we should also talk about seating arrangements. Since my mother is our guest of honor, she'll sit at the head of the table. David and I will sit on either side of her, and the kids will sit across from us. We've set up a comfortable spot for you at the end of the table where you'll be able to see everyone. The end of the table. In my son's dining room, I would be seated at the foot of the table like a distant relative invited out of obligation rather than love. Oh, and one more thing. My mother is very particular about certain things. She's quite successful in her own right. She owns a chain of medical spas in Phoenix, and she can be a little sensitive about social dynamics. So maybe on Thursday, you could just be, well, you know how you are, quiet and sweet. I think that would make the best impression. Quiet and sweet. She was asking me to perform the role of the grateful, unobtrusive elderly mother who knew her place in the family hierarchy. She wanted me to present myself in a way that wouldn't challenge Barbara Foster's understanding of who was important in this family and who was not. That night, I spent hours in my home office reviewing the documents I had been preparing for this moment. 3 years of careful planning were about to pay off. I had bank statements, property records, and financial reports that would reveal the true scope of my wealth. I had recordings of phone conversations where David and Amanda discussed my situation in ways they never would have if they thought I could hear them. I had a detailed log of every dollar they had given me and every condescending comment they had made about my supposed financial irresponsibility.
But most importantly, I had the phone number of my lawyer, Jonathan Richards, who had been standing by for months, waiting for my signal to execute the plan we had developed together. Thursday morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical November weather in Seattle. I woke up early, feeling more alert and energetic than I had in months. Today was the day I would stop pretending to be someone I wasn't. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant navy dress that I had bought years ago, but rarely wore because Amanda had once commented that it was a bit fancy for someone in my circumstances. I did my hair and makeup with more care than usual, wanting to look like the successful businesswoman I actually was, rather than the struggling retiree I had been pretending to be. Before leaving for David and Amanda's house, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Jonathan Richards. "It's time," I told him. "Execute the plan we discussed." "Are you absolutely certain about this, Elizabeth?" he asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I'm certain. Send the documents to their house at exactly 4 p.m. That should give me time to have the conversation first." The second call was to my property manager, Helen Davies, who had been managing my rental properties for the past decade. Helen was one of the few people who knew about my wealth, and I had asked her to be on standby for this day. "Helen, I'm going to need you to prepare a comprehensive report of all my properties and their current market values," I said. "Something that would be immediately understandable to lay people, and I'll need it this afternoon." "The full portfolio? That's quite a document." "All 52 properties, current market values, monthly rental income, occupancy rates, everything. Can you have it ready by 3 o'clock? "Absolutely. Shall I email it to you?" "Email it to my lawyer. He'll know what to do with it." I arrived at David and Amanda's house at 2 p.m., carrying my simple green bean casserole that I had indeed made from a can, just as Amanda had suggested.
It felt strange to bring such a modest contribution to a family gathering, but it was part of the role I was playing for the last time.
Amanda met me at the door, looking stressed and slightly frantic. She was wearing a new dress that was clearly expensive, and her hair had been professionally styled. Everything about her appearance was calculated to impress her mother. "Elizabeth, right on time. Come in, come in. My mother is so excited to meet you properly." I stepped into the house and immediately heard a commanding voice from the living room. "Is that Elizabeth? Bring her in here so I can get a look at her." Barbara Foster was exactly what I had expected. A woman in her early 60s who had clearly spent considerable time and money maintaining her appearance. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup was flawless, and her jewelry was expensive but tasteful. She was sitting in the best chair in the living room, the chair I usually occupied when I visited, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "So, you're the famous Elizabeth," she said as I approached, looking me up and down appraisingly. "Amanda has told me so much about you." I wondered exactly what Amanda had told her, but I simply smiled and extended my hand. "It's lovely to meet you properly, Barbara. Welcome to Seattle." "Well, it's certainly different from Phoenix," she said with a slight laugh. "All this gray and dampness. I don't know how you people stand it." You people. I was apparently grouped with all the other unfortunate residents of the Pacific Northwest who lacked the good sense to live somewhere more pleasant. David appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron and looking harried. "Hi, Mom. Thanks for coming. How's the green bean casserole?" "Simple and economical, just as Amanda requested," I said, handing him the dish. "Perfect. We're trying to keep everything low-key this year," he said, though I noticed he seemed nervous rather than relaxed. Over the next hour, as we waited for dinner to be ready, I observed the family dynamics with the clarity of someone who is seeing them objectively for the first time in years. Barbara clearly considered herself the guest of honor and expected everyone else to cater to her preferences. She dominated every conversation, interrupting others when they tried to speak and dismissing any topics that didn't interest her. "Sophie, stop fidgeting with your phone and pay attention when I'm talking to you," she commanded, my granddaughter who was trying to show her a school project. Amanda hung on her mother's every word, laughing too loudly at Barbara's not very funny jokes and constantly asking if she needed anything.
"Mother, are you comfortable? Do you want me to adjust the temperature? Can I get you some wine?" David seemed caught between trying to please both his wife and his mother-in-law while also managing the cooking responsibilities that were clearly overwhelming him. "The turkey might be a little dry," he confessed to Amanda during one of his trips from the kitchen. "I think I overcooked it." "It'll be fine," Amanda said quickly, though I could see the panic in her eyes at the thought of serving a substandard meal to her critical mother. And me? I was largely ignored unless someone needed me to perform a small task or validate their efforts. "Elizabeth, could you set the table?" Amanda asked, without looking at me. "Elizabeth, would you mind keeping an eye on Mason while I check on the potatoes?" David requested. I was useful for minor chores, but I wasn't really part of the family conversation. When I did try to contribute to the discussion, my comments were met with polite but dismissive responses. "I read an interesting article about the Seattle real estate market," I said during a lull in Barbara's monologue about Phoenix weather. "That's nice, Mom," David said absently, clearly not listening. "Elizabeth, could you make sure the kids wash their hands before dinner?" Amanda interrupted before I could continue. I was being managed, directed, and ignored in the same way one might treat a well-meaning but not very bright relative who needed to be kept busy but couldn't be trusted with anything important. Finally, at 4 p.m., Amanda announced that dinner was ready. We moved to the dining room, where the table was set with Amanda's second-best china and grocery store flowers. Everything was adequate but unremarkable, a stark contrast to the Thanksgiving feasts I had been hosting for years. The seating arrangement was exactly as Amanda had described: Barbara at the head of the table, David and Amanda flanking her, the children across from their parents, and me relegated to the foot of the table where I could observe the family, but wasn't really part of it. As we sat down, I noticed that the table setting was slightly wrong. The salad forks were on the wrong side, the water glasses were too close to the dinner plates, and the napkins were the cheap paper kind rather than cloth. These weren't major errors, but they were the kinds of details that someone with real entertaining experience would have noticed.
I didn't comment on any of these issues. I simply took my assigned seat and waited for what I knew was coming. The first part of dinner proceeded predictably. Barbara dominated the conversation with stories about her business success, her recent travels, and her opinions about everything from politics to the quality of Seattle restaurants, which she found generally disappointing. Amanda hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and expressing admiration for her mother's accomplishments. "You're so inspiring, Mother. I don't know how you managed to be so successful while maintaining such high standards for everything." David contributed occasional comments, but seemed primarily focused on the mechanical aspects of the meal: carving the turkey, passing dishes, refilling glasses. The children ate quietly, occasionally trying to join the conversation but being quickly redirected by their parents. "Not now, Sophie. Grandma Barbara's telling us about her business." And I sat at the foot of the table, eating my dry turkey and listening to Barbara's self-aggrandizing stories while my own family treated me like a piece of furniture. The first real moment of tension came when Barbara asked about my living situation. "Amanda tells me you live alone in a big house," she said, turning her attention to me for the first time since we'd sat down. "That must be quite a lot of work for someone your age." "I manage fine," I said simply. "But surely it's more house than you really need, and the expense must be considerable." I felt David and Amanda's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond to this probing question about my finances. "The house has sentimental value. It's where David grew up. Sentiment is all well and good, but at some point practicality has to take priority. Amanda and David have told me about their financial assistance to you. Surely it would make more sense for you to downsize to something more appropriate for your circumstances." More appropriate for my circumstances. She was suggesting that my own house was too good for someone of my presumed low social and economic status. "Mother," Amanda said quickly, though whether she was trying to protect me from embarrassment or protect herself from being associated with my poverty wasn't clear.
No, it's fine," Barbara continued. "These are practical conversations that families need to have. I'm sure Elizabeth understands that we're all looking out for her best interests." Looking out for my best interests without knowing anything about my actual interests, desires, or capabilities. "Have you thought about assisted living?" Barbara asked directly. "There's some very nice facilities that provide meals and housekeeping, much more suitable for elderly people who can't maintain their own homes anymore." Can't maintain their own homes anymore? She had decided, based on nothing more than Amanda's description of my financial situation, that I was incapable of caring for myself or my property. I felt the familiar spark of anger, but this time I didn't suppress it. This time I let it grow into the righteous fury I had been holding back for 3 years. "Actually," I said calmly, "I've been thinking about making some changes to my living situation." Amanda and David looked relieved, probably assuming I was finally going to acknowledge the wisdom of their suggestions. "What kind of changes?" David asked. "Well, I've been reviewing my finances recently, and I realize
I haven't been completely honest with you about my situation." The table went quiet. Barbara leaned forward slightly, probably expecting me to confess to hidden debts or financial desperation that would justify their paternalistic treatment of me. "The truth is, I'm not nearly as dependent on your financial help as you believe." I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I had prepared that morning. It contained bank statements, property records, and a summary of my net worth. All the evidence I needed to prove what I was about to tell them. I'm actually quite financially secure on my own. I placed the envelope on the table in front of Barbara, since she seemed to have appointed herself as the family's expert on financial matters. "What's this?" she asked, opening the envelope. "Documentation of my actual financial situation. I think you'll find it quite different from what you've been led to believe." Barbara pulled out the first document, a bank statement showing my checking account balance of $925,000. Her eyes widened as she read the number.
"This can't be right," she said, looking at Amanda. "You said she was living on Social Security." "She is," Amanda said, but her voice was uncertain now. "Elizabeth, what is this?" I pulled out my phone and called Jonathan Richards, who answered immediately. "Jonathan, it's time for the full disclosure. Yes, please proceed with everything we discussed." I hung up and turned back to my family, who were staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. "I am the founder and CEO of Thompson Property Holdings," I announced calmly. "I own 52 properties in the greater Seattle area. My net worth is approximately $18.5 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Barbara was frantically shuffling through the documents in the envelope, her face growing paler as she read each one. Amanda's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound was coming out. David had gone completely still, his fork halfway to his mouth, as if he had been frozen in time. "This isn't possible," Amanda managed to say. "You've been taking money from us. You've been complaining about expenses. You've been acting?" I finished for her. "Yes, I have been acting. For 3 years, I have been pretending to be the poor, helpless elderly woman you seem to need me to be." "But why?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I wanted to know who you really were. I wanted to understand how you would treat me if you believed I had nothing to offer you but the burden of my existence. And now I know." I stood up from my seat at the foot of the table and walked to the head of the table, where Barbara was still clutching my financial documents. "For 3 years, you have treated me like a charity case. You have patronized me, condescended to me, and made decisions about my life without consulting me. You have taken credit for being generous when you were giving me $1,000 a month when I was earning nearly $200,000 a month from my properties." I turned to face Amanda directly. "You have been embarrassed by my supposed poverty. You have tried to control my spending, manage my social interactions, and dictate my living arrangements. You have talked about me behind my back as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved." Amanda's face had gone bright red. "But you never said—" "I never said anything because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you had power over me. And what I discovered is that you are the kind of people who use someone's vulnerability to make yourselves feel important. I turned to David, my son, the child I had raised and loved and sacrificed for. And you," I said, my voice heavy with disappointment, "you were willing to let your wife treat your mother like a burden because it was easier than standing up for me?" "Mom, he started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. Today, you seated me at the foot of the table in my own son's dining room. You gave me a side dish to contribute to a meal that I have been hosting for years. You talked about my house as if it were too good for someone like me. You discussed my need for assisted living as if I were incompetent to make my own decisions." I walked back to where I had been sitting and picked up my purse.
And 30 minutes ago, a complete stranger, I gestured toward Barbara, suggested that I was too old and poor to maintain my own home, and not one of you defended me. Barbara finally found her voice. I had no idea. Amanda told me you were struggling financially. Yes, she did. Because that's how she sees me. Not as the woman who built a multi-million-dollar business empire, but as the pathetic elderly mother-in-law who needs to be managed and controlled. Just then the doorbell rang. Perfect timing. That will be my lawyer, I said. He has some documents for you. David went to answer the door while we all sat in stunned silence. He returned with Jonathan Richards, a distinguished man in his 60s carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Thompson, Jonathan said formally, I have the documents you requested. He opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of papers, which he placed on the table. These are the revised terms of Mrs. Thompson's will, he announced to the room. As of today, her previous will naming David Thompson as primary beneficiary has been revoked. David's face went white. Mom, you can't be serious.
I am completely serious. Jonathan, please explain the new terms. Jonathan cleared his throat and began reading from the document. Mrs. Thompson's estate, valued at approximately $18.5 million, will be distributed as follows: 50% to various charities supporting elderly people who have been abandoned or mistreated by their families. The remaining 50% will be held in trust for David Thompson and his children, to be distributed only if certain conditions are met. What conditions? Amanda asked, her voice shaking. The conditions are simple, I said, taking the document from Jonathan. David and Amanda must demonstrate that they can treat me with the respect and love that any person deserves, regardless of their financial situation. I read from the list I had prepared. First, you must visit me at least twice per month for genuine conversations lasting at least 2 hours each time. Not duty visits where you check on the poor old lady, but real visits where you treat me as an equal. Second, you must include me in all major family decisions and seek my input before making changes that affect our family dynamics. No more unilateral decisions about where Thanksgiving will be held or what role I'll play in family gatherings. Third, you must treat me with the same respect you would show to any other successful business person. That means no more lectures about my spending, no more suggestions about downsizing my house, and no more assumptions about my capabilities based on my age. Fourth, you must never again make decisions about my care, my living arrangements, or my finances without my explicit consent. I am a competent adult, and I will be treated as such. And fifth, I said, looking directly at Amanda, you must publicly acknowledge that your treatment of me was based on false assumptions about my financial situation, and you must apologize for the patronizing and condescending way you have spoken to me and about me. I folded the document and put it back in my purse. You have 2 years to demonstrate that you can meet these conditions. If you can, you will be restored to my will as equal inheritors with the charities I have selected. If you cannot, my entire estate will go to organizations that help elderly people who have been abandoned by their families. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Barbara's labored breathing. Finally, David spoke. This is blackmail. No, I said calmly. This is consequences. For 3 years, you have treated me badly because you thought you could get away with it. Now you know that there are costs to that behavior.
I walked toward the door, then turned back to face them one last time. The difference is that my deception was designed to reveal your true character, while your behavior revealed something about yourselves that you might not want to admit. When you thought I was powerless, you were comfortable treating me as less than an equal. Now that you know I have power, you're angry that I used it. I opened the door and stepped outside into the gray Seattle afternoon. Jonathan will be in touch about the legal details. I suggest you think carefully about whether you want to have a real relationship with me or whether you prefer to maintain the fiction that your treatment of me was justified by my supposed circumstances. I walked to my car and drove away from the house where I had just detonated the foundation of my family's understanding of who they were and who I was. For the first time in 3 years, I felt completely free. Today, as I write this story, it's been 5 years since my Thanksgiving revelation. I'm now 73 years old, and my net worth has grown to approximately $32 million, thanks to Seattle's continued real estate boom and some wise investments in technology stocks. More importantly, my relationship with my family has evolved into something I never expected during those dark years when I was pretending to be dependent on their charity. David fulfilled all of my conditions consistently for the full 2 years, and in November 2023, I restored him to my will as an equal inheritor with my selected charities. But more significantly, our relationship has become genuinely close and reciprocal. He seeks my advice on business decisions and includes me in all major family planning and treats me as the respected matriarch I always should have been. Amanda took longer to come around, but she eventually did. The turning point came when she asked for my help in starting her own law practice. She needed both financial backing and business advice, and she had to overcome her pride to ask for my assistance. "I know I haven't always treated you fairly," she said during that conversation. "I've been thinking about that a lot, and I realized I was jealous of your success. I felt threatened by the idea that you were more accomplished than I was." It was the first time she had acknowledged the deeper psychological issues that had driven her behavior, and it opened the door to a more honest relationship between us. Today, Amanda and I are not exactly friends, but we are family members who respect each other. She includes me in decision-making, values my opinion, and has taught her children to see me as someone worth emulating rather than someone to be managed. Speaking of the children, Sophie is now 18 and headed to college in the fall. She's planning to study business and has asked if she can intern at Thompson Property Holdings during her summer breaks. Mason is 16 and has become an excellent investor, using the money from his savings account to buy stocks and track their performance.
Both children have learned valuable lessons about money, respect, and family dynamics from watching our conflict and its resolution. They understand that wealth brings opportunities, but doesn't excuse bad behavior, and they've seen that it's possible to rebuild relationships even after serious damage has been done. My business continues to thrive. Thompson Property Holdings now owns 67 properties and generates over $400,000 per month in rental income. I've brought David in as a partner, and we're exploring opportunities to expand into commercial real estate development. More importantly, I've established the Thompson Foundation, which provides financial assistance and advocacy services to elderly people who have been mistreated or taken advantage of by their families. It's become one of my most rewarding projects, helping people who found themselves in situations similar to what I experienced. But the most significant change in my life has been personal rather than financial. I no longer feel the need to hide who I am or diminish my accomplishments to make other people comfortable. I live openly as a successful businesswoman, a generous philanthropist, and a family matriarch who expects to be treated with respect. I've learned that pretending to be powerless doesn't protect you from being mistreated. It actually enables mistreatment by people who might otherwise behave better. I've learned that love without respect is not really love at all, but rather a form of emotional manipulation. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to demand better treatment from the people you love, even if doing so requires dramatic action and painful confrontations. My story began with a secret I kept for 3 years to test my family's character. It became a story about power, respect, and the courage required to change dysfunctional family dynamics. But ultimately, it's a story about hope. Hope that people can change when the right incentives are in place.
Hope that families can heal from serious wounds if everyone is willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. Hope that it's possible to grow old with dignity and autonomy, surrounded by people who value you for who you are, rather than seeing you as a burden to be managed. To anyone reading this who recognizes elements of their own family relationships, I want you to know that you don't have to accept disrespectful treatment just because it comes from people who claim to love you. You have the right to set boundaries, demand better behavior, and take dramatic action if necessary to protect your dignity and autonomy. Love without respect is not love. Help without consent is not help. Family loyalty that requires you to diminish yourself is not loyalty worth preserving. You are worth fighting for, even if you have to do the fighting yourself.
This story is fictional, but inspired by real experiences of many elderly people who find themselves patronized and controlled by well-meaning family members. Names, places, and specific details have been changed to protect privacy. If you were in Elizabeth's situation, what would you have done? Would you have revealed the truth earlier, or would you have taken an even more dramatic approach? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about family dynamics, respect between generations, and how we can better support elderly family members while honoring their autonomy and dignity.